Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1057. And today I will continue with Tarthang Tulku and the book The Love of Knowledge. I am presently at chapter 19, page 155. All movement, overlapping prospects rotate, control out of control, forward fragments taking shape. Intention, momentum, knowing less, knowingness. The reign of intentional knowledge. Intentional knowledge complements and completes the world revealed in descriptive knowledge, making that world meaningful to the self. So it's the intention, and it's the intention that makes the text go haywire. It is when intention inhabits the text or erodes the text when we can't reach into it. This is when the problem starts. And this is what is addressed here in chapter 9. Since the content of experience is described and identified in terms of the self's concerns, intentional knowledge could even be considered the more basic of the two. Even so, intentional knowledge does not improve on descriptive knowledge in its capacity to give the self satisfaction, because the force of desire and wanting thrusts the self ahead into what might be the possibility of enjoying what is already present is blocked. Yet the anticipated joys of the future, as distinct from the double-edged pleasures of anticipation itself, are not yet available to be tasted and experienced. And when the guiding image of future satisfaction is at last obtained, the transplanting of the desired object from one aspect of time to another, from image to object, alters its makeup and destroys its allure. Just as memory will always differ from the original experience, so whatever is attained departs from the one's imagined goal. Tightly bound by yesterday, swept along into tomorrow, the self is cut off from its world, stranded and isolated. Its ways of knowing fosters not knowing. Its ways of fulfillment results in frustration. The self lives in the present, like a traveler in an inhospitable foreign land, ill at ease, unsure how to act, never really at home with its experience. Next paragraph. The life of feelings. When the world of attained objects proves unsatisfying, the self can turn inward to the subjective realm of feelings and emotions. Whereas objects seem not to be directly knowable and goals seem not to be directly achievable, feelings and emotions do seem directly accessible, rather than being bound to a vanished past or a future that remains out of reach. Feelings are the immediate stuff of experience, undeniably available in the present. There seems little doubt that feelings offer a kind of nourishment that would be difficult to obtain in any other way. For all their immediacy, however, feelings and emotions remain bound to the future-centered structures of intentional knowledge. They are the subjective expressions of the patterns of desire and longing, working themselves out through time. In fact, the turn toward feeling could be understood as a choice of intentional over descriptive knowledge, of what is felt over what is perceived. With this choice comes a shift in focus from what is desired to the longing or the satisfaction that desire brings in its wake. The result is a knowing that can hardly be said to know at all. The self sucks on its feelings like a toothless old dog chewing on a sharp bone, mistaking the taste of its own blood for fresh, juicy meat. It judges good and bad, right and wrong by taste, and fights like a hungry beast for the object that its desire singles out. Understanding is filtered through the cyclic patterns of hope and fear. Intelligence, reasoning, discrimination, and language are reduced to subordinate role, providing the attendant stories and rationales that serves to assure commitment to the reign of feeling. Reduced to this level, intentional knowledge comes close to abandoning what seems specifically human in the capacity to know. When the gut-level knowledge of feelings and emotion is installed as their arbiter of truth, life becomes an emotional roller coaster. The self responds to patterns that constantly fluctuate, seeking out the highs, avoiding the lows, or resigned to the shadow world of emotional indifference. Focused in on its own responses, the self lacks clarity about what is happening in its life. Passing desires are mistaken for heartfelt conviction. Changing circumstances are easily overlooked, and the lesson of past experience easily ignored. Disregard for key elements in new situations leads to an increasingly distorted views over time. In the end, the turn inward toward feelings turns the world upside down. Thinking that it is following a path based on immediate sensation, the self remains bound by the future-centered orientation of intentional knowledge, and so experiences continuing frustration, yearning for an object world fulfillment that remains out of reach. The self finds that the patterns of its life bring stagnation and endless repetition. Yet, if the commitment to feelings is complete, this stagnation is reinterpreted as the perpetual promise of the new. Though a life based on feelings may seem rich in happenings, there is little sense of a knowledge that could give those happenings significance. There may be many times of unexpected pleasures, when the range of experience exceeds the grasp of the imagination, suggesting a rich new potential. But the special delight of such times only emphasizes how barren are the usual patterns. Although aware that something is amiss, the self lacks recourse to a knowledge beyond feelings that could let it shape its life differently. Dreams and fantasies seem tightly bound to disappointment and frustration, or else to dullness, boredom, and anxiety. Unwanted changes are succeeded by feelings of repetition and sameness in a never-ending cycle. The exhilaration of chasing after desires fails to conceal the underlying sense of a world stripped bare of significance and value, devoid of knowing, difficult to bear. A deeper sense of loss prevails, and moments of real joy and openness are rare. Strategies for control, next paragraph. Instead of following the path of feelings and emotions, the self may try to reclaim a more meaningful knowledge by bringing its world under control. Feelings continues to determine values, but descriptive knowledge is reinstated and given a new domain and a new task, the fulfilling of desires. In this way, the turn toward intentional knowledge transforms descriptive knowledge into technology, as discussed in part 1. Intent of manipulating its world. The self relies on methods for knowing that promote a sense of mastery, logic, measurement, rhetoric, machinery. It establishes itself as arbiter of experience, separating the good times from the bad, judging and comparing. It asserts power where it can and builds defenses where it cannot. Such strategies, however, do nothing to alter the basic intentional structure that allows fulfillment only in the future. No matter how far an object-centered technological knowledge may extend its mastery, the objects of desire continue to remain out of reach. Technological knowledge promises results, and the self may continue to believe in that promise despite repeated disappointment. Stubbornly, it responds to frustration by seeking more of the same: more food, more sleep, more excitement, more oblivion. It runs its life as a foreman might run a factory that continue to produce with great efficiency a product for which the market had disappeared long ago. Not recognizing that the cost of fuel and maintenance far outweighs the value of what it is producing, the self pours its limited capital into upkeep and new machinery, squanders its resources to no purpose, charting a course toward bankruptcy. Technological knowledge places the objective realm in the service of intentional knowledge, but leaves intact the frustrations of the intentional mode. The endless segments of technologically measured out time seem to disperse and to diffuse the self's energy, while endless complications of a technologically patterned life leaves no room for change. Every situation is a problem, and every solution creates new difficulties. Space is filled up with the structures adopted by technological knowing. Time is measured out in advance, like a desert tracked with endless footprints. There may be discipline, but it leads nowhere. There may be creativity, but it's channeled into rigid routines. Even when the promised results are attained, no satisfaction can be found. A little summary here, chapter 19. Lack of satisfaction in intentional knowledge, the turn toward feelings, loss of knowledge, strategies for control, move toward technology, self-energy dispersed and diffused, no satisfaction. Object of desire. Imagine whatever object you desire most. Let this imagination build, intensifying the associated field of energy until the mind almost becomes the image. Maintaining this energy, take the time to build up and enrich every aspect of the imagined perceptual situation, including form, shape and qualities, as well as the attitude, intention and feeling you bring to it. This exercise can also be combined with exercise 8. Chapter 20. All sides. Before, around, surround. Define, confine, refine. Beyond, respond. In choke, genetic patterning. Knowledge before knowledge. Identity before identity. Questions for convention. Guidance and direction. An intentional knowledge confined to the limited world of feeling and emotions threatens descent into anarchy, while technological knowledge offers order without meaning or satisfaction. Yet this is not the whole picture. Human society is structured in ways that inhibit the absolute reign of feelings and give coherence to the mechanisms of control. A source of guidance and direction is in operation. In their daily activities, human beings can turn for support to the culturally transmitted assembly of definitions and interpretations that constitute the fundamentals of being human. Language, shared understanding and values, and the matrix for personal interaction. This system as a whole could be called collective knowledge. Collective knowledge balances the self's narrow preoccupation with its own desires and feelings and directs the efforts of technological knowing. It offers stability and security together with a kind of routinized knowing that suggests appropriate responses in a variety of possible situations. Collective knowledge itself is only the historical manifestation or extension through time of descriptive and intentional knowing. Each new generation is born into a world governed by such knowledge. It absorbs the complex understandings of those who have come before and passes that knowledge on to future generations. In this sense, collective knowledge is the field of temporal knowing, based on the same descriptive structures and intentional momentum that generates individual knowledge. It binds the awareness tightly to the identified structures of the past and intended prospects for the future. Abiding by its standards, each individual follows a way established by others. The field of collective knowledge has a structure and a dynamic of its own. The transmission of collective knowledge allows new knowledge to be manufactured and distributed like a product on an assembly line. There can be revisions and modifications in what is known, and established factors can recombine in various ways, but the underlying structures remain. If all standards break down, new ones quickly emerge to replace them, like new patterns taking shape in a kaleidoscope. Even such shifts are rare. For the most part, fields of knowledge and the general culture faithfully replicate in different guises the prevailing views of self and the world. objects and desires. Collective knowledge thus supports the structures of observation and inference. Knowledge may increase in scope but not in depth. Missing the dimension of depth, space becomes simply volume and begins to fill up. The things of the world grew dark and impenetrable, and experience untrustworthy. To counter the proliferation of surfaces and mechanical interaction, collective knowledge turned to a more psychological understanding. But now emotions and feelings are put in control, and once more meaning and order slide towards chaos. Hope for finding a deeper significance in human action fades. Crowding and tension. As collective knowledge duplicates itself, unchecked by alternatives, the proliferation of all patterns gives the sense that space within the field is being filled up. Over time, the products of accustomed knowledge, models, structures, identities, multiply, confining active knowing to an even smaller domain. The field becomes increasingly crowded, like a warehouse filled to the rafters. All of space is occupied with self and structures. And still it fills up more. With continued crowding, a kind of pollution clouds the atmosphere, and pressure builds, threatening to explode the boundaries of the known world. A constant stream of new explanation, facts and diversions fail to relieve the pressure. Instead, it only adds to the crowding. With no other source of knowledge available, confusion is always close at hand. Simply coping with the situations of daily living drains off energy. The momentum of crowding may engender a sense of intensity and high energy. On the cultural level, there may be periods of rapid change, even revolution. Such upheavals may clear the air like a summer thunderstorm, but beneath the agitation, the knowing faculty remains confined. Space is full and time used up. History is an ever heavier burden. There is no room for inner freedom, open communication, or meaningful accomplishment. Living in such a field, we are no longer the owners of our own experience. The past gave birth to the images and concepts we use to make sense of the world. And these become the parents of the future. New thoughts must conform to the structures of the old. A thought that goes off in another direction will no longer be thoughtful. While patterns vary in ways that we may consider vitally important, sameness plays beneath the surface. Whether we see this situation clearly or not, we feel a tightening grip that chokes off creativity and leaves no chance for autonomy. Lacking avenues of expression, our wants and desires build, adding their outward pressure to the inward pressure of the self's ever-narrowing horizons. We are like people who have responded to the threat of anarchy by inviting a foreign army to preserve order, and now find themselves the subjects of an invading force and its totalitarian regime. Chapter 20, Conclusion or Summarization. Stability for collective knowledge, support for temporal patterns, surfaces, crowding and pressure, intensity without autonomy. Calming body, mind and senses. Imagine a situation, either positive or negative, real or imagined, that evokes a powerful emotional response. Focus on the aliveness of the response rather than the content of the situation or its tone. Then practice maintaining this aliveness while allowing the emotional, agitated quality to subside, leaving clarity behind. Once you are familiar with this exercise, you can practice it in the midst of situations where there is agitation, stress, and high energy. Note, this exercise can be deepened through personal instructions. Owning One, page 168, and now we are at chapter 20. Presenting past future, seizing and projecting, image or knowledge, self-found founders, story discloses closed, dimensions of knowledge, presenting the self. The self establishes its central position in descriptive and intentional knowledge through the structuring of the known world, at first laying claim to polar knowledge attributed to the activity of the moment-to-moment perceiver. The self goes on to present itself as the agent responsible for the organization of experience over time, through its all-important role as perceiver, knower, and actor. Just as in the space-centered view of objective reality, space itself disappears in favor of objects, so in the temporal view, knowledge as such disappears in favor of the intentions and concerns of the knowing all, or the known self. All concepts, categories, definitions, including time and self, trace to the self-interpretative activity. Moreover, the self is the one that sets goals and establishes projects, creating the sphere of meaning. Observation is completed by interpretation to produce the known world. Memory is coupled with anticipation and intention to give coherence and meaning to the flow of events. Acting as knower, interpreter, and meaning giver, the self seizes the past, authenticates the present, and projects the unfolding of the future. But who is this self? Precision in looking at the self will help us to summarize what has gone before and anticipate further directions for inquiry. Next paragraph. It seems that the activities of the self can be organized into 5 principal categories. First is the objective self, subject to history and conditioning, to birth, life, and death. This is the aspect of self that gives self-identity its content, a personal history and a personality, a set of goals and purposes, a physical locatedness, an embodied nature. But this self, the self as object, with an identity and characteristics knowable by others, is part of the world out there. It lacks the unique capacity of the self to occupy the here, which sets it apart from the rest of existence. Second is the self as perceiver, active, here, now, in the present, confined to the moment. This self lacks the power to shape, define, and organize experience. Third is the self as interpreter. This is the self as subject in a world of objects, defining, naming, and labeling, the self of descriptive knowledge, knowing on the basis of the past. But we have seen that interpretations lack the power to found themselves, as self-reliant on them is in the end only another interpretation. Fourth is the self as narrator, the self of intentional knowledge, whose nature we began to explore in chapter 19. The narrator gives meaning to events by directing them toward the future. The structure of this unfolding remains to be investigated. Fifth is the self as owner and witness, validating experience and reality, invalidating its own identity. The self that underlies and guarantees the perceiver, interpreter, and narrator. This is the core self, whose existence is the key to all temporal knowing. Efforts to establish the core self based on the self as perceiver and as interpreter have left us dissatisfied. Now we will investigate the self as narrator to see how the future-centered projects of intentionality relate to the underlying sense of self. The narrator and the founding story. The self as narrator actively links successive moments of knowing, wanting, and interpreting. It shapes the content of descriptive and intentional knowledge into an account that mirrors the seeming flow of time from past to future. The narrative stories make meaningful the self's doings, thoughts, and imaginings, giving coherence to the flow of events. The stories told by the narrative self are about the needs, desires, feelings, experiences, projects, and understandings of the self. Within their patterns, the self justifies plans, rehearses, judges, reasons, and feels emotions, desires, enjoys, rejects, and suffers. The rules of logic and social intercourse, the vivid imagery of the human mind, the interlocking domains of perception, feelings, naming, explanations, and interpretations all take their meaning and significance from the manifold structures of the web of stories. A single story may be fully formed, subtle and intricate, or fragmentary and suggestive. In either case, it allows for the possibility of subsidiary stories, bars the telling of conflicting stories, and establish a framework for later experience, defining the understanding within which descriptive and intentional knowledge operates. As stories interweave and grow more elaborate, parts slip out of view, too complex in form and content to be grasped as a whole. The growing complication and internal conflicts of the web of stories can lead to fascinating self-absorption. The self learns to turn its own story to its own stories for gratification and to make sense of events. Tracing out the patterns of interlocking stories permits the creation of new, more comprehensive or more satisfying stories, including stories about stories, or even stories, such this one, about how the storytelling mechanism operates. Common to all these stories is the narrator himself. Who is this narrator that tells the tales that shapes existence? A clear answer is given. It is none other than the actor at the center of every story, the owner of each experience. But the narrator is also none other than the audience that reacts to each story with emotions, explanations, justification, and more stories. Finally, the narrator is none other than the objective self, whose identity and attributes the intersecting narratives establish. The narrative stories unite owner, actor, and objective self, bearing witness to their existence and persistence over time. The central narrative structures I am, I feel, I experience, I want, I act, are the self-authenticating truth of every story. The narrator thus asserts the self by telling another story, a founding story that makes possible all other stories. For without an actor at its center, an audience in attendance and a teller of the tale, no story could unfold and meaning could not emerge. But this founding story is intended as its own witness, presented as the basis for the self and world alike. Assent to the presupposed, next paragraph. The ongoing persistence of a unified self appears to the mind as a self-evident truth. It brings with it two corollaries, the flow of experience from past to future, and the objective existence of surrounding world that is subject to that flow. The temporal dynamic of the self of history are parallel, indisputable structures. Such basic constructs, which already presupposes the polarities of descriptive and intentional knowledge, are set up and offered for interpretation before the mind knows it. Understanding, judgments, even the basic structures of consciousness itself, arise within this pre-existing matrix, which itself remains immune to inquiry. The entire range of self-centered knowledge, the facts of conventional experience known as scientifically in chemistry, biology, physiology, psychology and cosmology and the like, support the constructs and testifies to their reality. These consensus constructs, which center on the self, are the founding story. Established prior to all questioning, the founding story is self-perpetuating. Arguments may be advanced that undermine the logic of the unitary self. Alternative stories may be told, but it all takes place within the founding story. All knowing is directed towards points after the flow of self-centered experience is already in operation. No room is allowed for a more fundamental knowing that might investigate how the founding story itself is established. Universal assent to the founding story means unbridled power for the narratives that the founding story unfolds. For in terms of the claims of the self, apart from such narratives there is no reality. The world of historical time and of events bound together in meaningful patterns unfolds as a dynamic to which no countervailing force can be opposed. The rich texture of narrative exerts a hypnotizing effect that only reinforces the founding story. If stories are challenged, it is only through new stories. Even when stories repeat themselves with a numbing regularity, becoming so familiar that they are triggered almost automatically by the flow experience, the stereotyped response they produce allows for no alternative. Single-minded knowing. Based on the founding story of the self and the narrative structure it supports, a form of understanding arises that could be called single-minded. Whereas the perceiver observes from moment to moment, the self sweeps each new momentary image or event into the flow of the founding story's narrative, continuously sustaining and reaffirming the narrative. Each new experience is assigned a place within a web of needs, interests, situational patterns, and emotional reactions. Knowledge fits into this web as a tool for assigning identity or identifying goals. or as a vehicle for accomplishing what has been specified. It becomes an item to be acquired or manufactured for use within the framework of the self's concerns. When knowledge is thus subordinated to the single-minded momentum of the founding story, experience eludes illumination. The momentum of the narrative compels a linear logic unfolding in time in a linear way. In accord with this logic and with the self-understanding, knowing is bound to the predetermined truths of the descriptive knowledge, improbably understood as based on the fragmented and momentary structure of polar knowledge observation. As the narrative flows along, one observation identifies one specified quality, one subject takes in one point, one knower makes one judgment, resulting in one conclusion that is immediately linked to the next. As steady narrowing of choices in the end leaves only one option, the identical pattern plays itself out again and again, allowing only one truth, one perspective, one position. In committing to the narrative, the self finds the basis for asserting its identity. Just as the perceiver depends on the perceived, the narrator depends on the flow of the stories that its narrative sets forth. The perceived, the described, and the intended are all brought together to specify a historically determined world. And this historical construct is then acknowledged as the source of the temporal momentum. The self is discovered emerging from this historical matrix, like a baby emerging from the womb. In this way, the self gives to its narratives an unquestionable authority. Self and objects are placed on the same objective footing, with the self at the center and objects as useful adjuncts. Both arise through a historical conditioning that makes the past the source of what is real. The narrative commitment is reinterpreted as the truth of all that has happened in history, and it becomes a fact that truth unfolds only within the narrative structure of linear temporality. Chapter 21. Seizing on knowledge by the self. The five personas of the self, the narrator and the founding story of the self, knowledge subordinated to single-minded knowing, past as the source of reality. And now to the exercise. This is what I really like. There is always an exercise. And this goes to show you can train yourself. Otherwise, you just change your content. And this is a training. It's called protecting and projecting. Investigate the themes and the narratives around which mental activity seems to focus. What purposes do such narratives serve? What projects do they serve? Ask this question not only analytically, but exploring deeper, more encompassing narratives. Note that the sense of being distant that allows for this investigation is itself the outcome of a narrative. Continue to look for deeper, more encompassing narratives. At some point in this process, the content of the narratives may fall away, leaving attitudes such as hope and fear, anxiety and expectation to operate without their usual accompaniment. So, chapter 22, page 178. Twice determined, and the twofold we mentioned before. Self-witness to present, encircled by horizon reality of is and are, tracing from generated generations, generous genesis of, 2 times. The narratives of the self seem to presuppose the linear historical flow of time, as do the identities of both objective self and owner. Without linear time, what could happen to whom? Without linear time, what could happen to whom? How would experience be possible? To whom would it relate? And by whom would it be reported? Without the thread of time to hold it together, the fabric of cause and effect that produces objective identity and narratives alike at once unravels. In ordinary experience, the temporal thread is interwoven with the identity of the self as the I am. And I-awareness or I-ness accompanies and supports each occupied moment, linking sense fields, thoughts, interpretations and emotions in a way that is central to the spirit of human being. The link between past, present and future depends on this I am, which binds together moments in time and patterns to human affairs. Any attempt to investigate this interweaving of time and self-identity at once runs into difficulties. In conventional understanding, the self occupies each successive moment. As suggested in chapter 14, however, our understanding of a moment leads to the conclusion that each act of knowing already occupies its moment fully, leaving no room for the self. While the self lays claim to being the perceiver, the momentary structure of perception suggests that in the act of perception, the I is occupied the act of knowing. But what would this mean? When the mind is temporarily occupied by a daydream or an image, or by a distracting sound, or an inner dialogue, we say, I am preoccupied at the moment. The specific sense seems to be that such events use up our available energy, in the same way as a victorious occupying army uses up the country's resources. The analysis in chapter 14 of how moments of time are fully used up suggests that this same occupying phenomenon occurs on a more basic level, where we cannot directly observe it. This leaves us with 2 different views. The self occupies time in a unique way, or occupies a unique time. But events that occur in time also occupy the self. This duality relates to what was referred to earlier as the dual citizenship of the self and the 2 kinds of time to which the self seems to have access. The connection between self and time seems to be related to the energy and organizing capacity of both. Next paragraph. 2 views of time. Linear time is first the time of cause and effect, predictable and orderly. Each day the sun moves across the sky. Each night the planets cross the heavens. The passage from day to night gives way to passing of the seasons, and seasons mark the life and death of living things and the imperceptible shifts of geological time. This world of objective linear time offers a criterion for what is real. Objects exist as products of determinate past events. Trees exist while the content of image and dreams do not. The objective self satisfies this criterion, for it is the subject to historical unfolding of linear time. Having once appeared, it joins the march from moment to moment, like a pedestrian caught up in a parade. While this view of temporality has great explanatory power, it remains incomplete. For linear time is not only an unbroken flow, rather it is sharply divided into the three domains of past, present and future. The present moment stands at the exact center. To one side is the past, fixed and immutable. To the other is the future, not yet known but apparently predictable in principle. The threefold division of time is fundamental to direct experience. The being of what exists only in the past is completely different from the being of what exists only in the future, and both in turn are completely different from the being of what exists in the present. In terms of this division, it seems accurate to say that only what exists in the present has real being at all. What happened in the past may once have been real, but it no longer is. What will happen in the future may later be real, but is not yet. Something remarkable is at work in the view that the present alone is real, for the location of the present in time is established only by the presence within it of this particular I. Thus, the existence of all that seems to hinge on the wholly subjective fact of my being here. In addition, the threefold view of time appears incompatible with the object-centered linear time, in which the present seems to be the only ever-changing boundary between past and future. While conventional understanding would say that tomorrow has today as its origin, today is tomorrow's yesterday and yesterday is tomorrow. Moreover, yesterday came into being because it was once tomorrow. The ongoing succession of yesterdays and tomorrows encompasses the whole range of time, with the present only and no dimensional marker separating the two domains. How can what is most real occur exactly in this non-dimensional point? We also need to account for the fact that the present itself is constantly shifting. Each present moment is different from every other, except that there can only be one present moment at a time. Since what is real is only what exists in the present moment, does this mean that being is recreated in each moment? Does this mean that being is recreated in each moment? What is the dynamic that could give birth to such a remarkable structure? And if this is so, what has become of the principles of cause and effect, which determines what is real when we look at the other phase of linear time? Good question indeed. So summarize chapter 21. Self as occupied by moments of linear time. Reality as based on past. Alternative threefold view of time. Reality based on shifting present. Point of transition, practice of exercise 14 suggests that the points we recognize as linked in time are not necessarily fundamental units. Then how do we move from point to point in awareness? If we focus on a particular interval between points A and A1, we find that there is a moment of transition, x, that cannot ordinarily be directly observed and thus remains unknown. This establishes the following structure. A to A1 and X. Try investigating X directly or indirectly. Do not confuse a moment between moments with X, which must be related to the between rather than to a moment. What is the nature of X? How does it function? I think something that obviously comes into question here is the take on the theater. This shows how we build up the theater in ourselves and how we become passive in our experience. Of course, the theater cannot be outside ourselves. It must be an ongoing thing in the mind. Something established in antiquity, which Ian McGilchrist called the domain of the left hemisphere, the dominance of the left hemisphere, or something that Stephen M. Rosen calls, in Heideggerian terms, subject in front of space, with an object in it. Heidegger would say the closure of Western metaphysics, or the transcendental signified, as would be the phrase coming from Jacques Derrida or Rodolphe Cachet. But this is the first time I really hear how it is built up, point by point, structure by structure, and that makes it very interesting and very helpful, because we need to understand ourselves how this is done in order to see through it, and we need some details because our understanding is this. Therefore, it cannot be discovered from within or from without. Here we need a help, and the help is this. And once, so to say, mastered, we won't need this book anymore, and we don't have to make reference to it. But it will open up the thinking, because if we don't disclose how the theater situation that we talked about since almost a year ago when we started with Ian McGilchrist, the theater situation won't yield until we understand it. To say that we understand it is not the same thing as to really understand it. So even the understanding is different. Academic knowledge is knowing from the surface, is not knowing what could change. It's not having substance. And each subjective person acquiring academic knowledge is just reinventing the subjective contents they already have. There is no externality. Nothing is transferred from the teacher, professor, or the study material to the person. The person is simply renaming what it already has. And maybe the worst that, for instance, Wittgenstein pointed out, a person that says he's knowledgeable but has a horrible posture or don't have poise, is aching, is not happy, is unsatisfied, that person doesn't know anything at all. because knowledge is not separable from those things. Because with our happiness, that is the modus, the amount, this is with what you understand. And that amount is low in academia today. And if you don't meet somebody who can give that to you and give an explanation, it will remain low, remain under the level of awareness. Once you got above awareness, you will know much more how to take next path, so to speak. But until that moment, you will not know where to straddle, where to go. That is outside the picture, so to speak. Annoying whine going on here. I will jump now to chapter 24, page 192. And that is called Time Knowing. Rhythm of 1 into 2 gives 1 in quality shape form. 2 gives 1 through 3. Echo returns self through time, unfolds through well-known patterns. And this chapter is called It's the Self in Question. In certain moments, we see more in tune with the underlying energy that makes experience into a coherent whole, more free from the influence of interpretive structures. Energy, awareness and concentration are united and in balance, and the genuine dynamic and power allows us to act in ways that are reliable and effective. Focusing our minds and balancing our energy, we can be sharp, penetrating and one-pointed, able to control the operation of our senses. In such moments, reality seems most real, and the witness is at its strongest. But what is the content to which the witness testifies? Normally we interpret the message of the witness in terms of the identity of self and the substantiality of the world. But perhaps the witness is speaking of something very different. Suppose that beneath the time marked out in ordinary experience, there were a deeper time, a fabric into which the patternings presented in conventional time were woven, or else a dynamic whole without distinctions, a time presenting all meanings but prior to all meanings. If the witness were speaking of this deeper time, the usual interpretations that we give its message might prove ill-founded and misleading. The three aspects of time, past, present and future, might be understood as markers for an underlying dynamism of transition and change, within which body, mind and universe take form. The structure of self in the world might yield to a way of being at once more open and more free. If the story of the self proved to be only another story, conditioning and limitations would fall away. Time, space and knowledge would perhaps bear witness in completely new ways. The self that knows through observation. This is paragraph, the self as subject. The self that knows through observation and descriptive knowledge is the subject, or I, taking things in the world as object. In observation, I stand as if at the edge of a pool, looking into its depths in solitary, intimate confrontation with the universe. My position is lonely, but also powerful. Isolated from everything else, I can hardly be said to exist, and yet I am the knower, the one who brings awareness to being. Only my knowing can authenticate the objective world that appears to lie stretched out before me. In polar and descriptive knowledge alike, the act of observation that gives rise to knowledge is always directed outward. In searching for the self, can I turn to see myself directly instead of in the pool's reflection? The pool is too close and vast. It fills my field of vision completely. When I try to turn, I find the pool is still before me. Nothing has changed. I can know my objective trace, but it seems that I can't know the knower as knower. Then how can I establish my own existence? The answer seems to be that I establish myself in observing the objective pool. As I gaze into the pool, my image as a subject is reflected back to me. In knowing, I observe, categorize and characterize. I apply names and labels. This activity itself seems to be what I label as I. The unique energy that I bring to knowing, mirror back to me, confirms the truth of my existence at the center of experience. I find myself reflected everywhere, for each known object, insofar as it's known, is my creation. If I as a subject is only the reflection of what is the object or what the object reveals, then which is the truly subject and which is object? Which is the actor and which is the acted upon? Knowing and interpreting, the subject projects his projections into the objective realm. But each knowing is a knowing of the knowable. And what is knowable, including the existence of the knower, is only what the object projects into the subject. In this complex interaction, is the objective world my projection, or is it perhaps more accurate to say that I am its creation? Instead of standing at the center of experience, am I the shadow image of my own knowing? Where in this picture is the substantial identity that I assert and rely on to found my sense on what is real? The self claims ownership over its experience, but how can it establish its own independent existence apart from what it owns? One answer that has emerged in various systems of thought is to identify with what is owned. For example, the self owns a body. Perhaps it is this body, as materialist thinkers have suggested. Again, the self owns its experiences, but perhaps the self is simply the sum of total of these experiences. In that case, however, what has become of the sense of the self as owner, with its own existence independent on what is owned? How can a self that is nothing other than its experiences or its physical sensations, whether these are directed outward or are focused on inner body states, found the reality of those experiences? Next paragraph. The self at the center. If the self as owner of experience is separate from the experienced owned, it must be because the self is present independently. When experience begins, there is already a self there, to whom the experience happens, a self enduring over time, perhaps even in some mysterious way taking priority over time. But this assumed pre-existence of the self depends squarely on the problematic flow of linear time from moment to moment. If this temporal structure is open to doubt, as the discussion in chapter 15 seemed to suggest, the link between cause and effect is severed, and the rhythms of my life are replaced by the chaos. If I can never plan my actions or assess their value, the structures of personal identity, experiences, and meaningful action all collapses. Only sequences of causes and conditions occurring predictably over time can make experience available for ownership and for the assigning of narrative significance. We return to the sense of witness, even if the self-interpretation proves to be incoherent. There is something or someone that continues to occupy the center of experienced reality, perceiving, interpreting, experiencing and making sense of experience by assigning it to it an owner designated as self. Bearing witness. Yet even on this level, where logic and analysis seem to be unable to penetrate, there is room for questioning. We saw at the outset of this chapter that the witness is strongest at those times when energy, awareness, and appreciation for experience are alive and in balance, and we act with a special dynamic and power. But it's just in those moments, with the mind fully focused, the awareness engaged and energy most dynamic, that the sense of self is most attenuated, and the sense of self-consciousness that often hinders effective action and well-being is least present. In such moment, does the self bear witness against itself? The founding story recognizes an actor, events, and the unfolding of the narrative. The self unites these elements, possessing experience and organizing it into meaningful patterns. And the founding story asserts that this owner in turn is identical with the witness, the one who verifies the identity of the self. Perhaps we have misunderstood the knowledge to which the witness testifies. For the witness can only be witness if it is more than another story told within the fundamental structure of the founding story. When the self appropriates the witness, sweeping it within the storytelling structure, it may be bearing false witness. In that case, the true source of the creative energy that the self seems to manifest might be found elsewhere, in a realm yet to be explored. So, summarizing of chapter 24. Misinterpreting the witness in terms of self. Subject self as a reflection, self-dependent on linear time. Witness as testifying to the creative energy appropriated by the self. Locating tension in space. Subtle tension is associated with physical location. Locate tensions in terms of the body, then in terms of the mind or awareness, considered in spatial terms. Expand the field of inquiry to be aware of the body's locatedness in space. With continued practice, this sense of locatedness can become central in experienced tensions or other feelings. replacing the usual narrative focus. Do shifts in this sense affect the feeling of tension or related sensations? I would say this last one is an invitation to quantify your knowledge, to make knowledgeability, the skill of knowledge, not the content, to become more. And in this moreness, the knowledge you already have can go from being more in the region of monosemic to become more polysemic, and therefore enforcing everything you think, do and act. And I would say knowledge is not a knowledge if it doesn't help everything. If not everything is helped by it, it's no knowledge. And I would say there's an indirect criticism of academic knowledge, because that doesn't help anything, not even itself. You don't get better in writing academia from studying academia either. As Rodolphe Cachet said, an academia that doesn't support itself on its own genuine being, it's not an academia anymore. That is in the past. And he had a sharp point there. We need to be knowledgeable first, and that's depth of knowledge. And what Tarthang Tulku is pointing to here, it's direct mirroring. That very hard thing to understand, that cannot come to you verbally. It has to be imagined. Once you understand the mirror, it all opens up, and it's an incredible release. But it's also a deepening of knowledge. It is intellectualization, it is analyzing and all those things that is absent in academia, and that can be regained. Nothing is gone forever. And please also do read the book The Matter with Things, because it contains so much of this material. Research to help you understand and also believe, but also punctuations and his grand demeanor in explaining things that are otherworldly hard otherwise to understand. He has done a service to humanity that's not to be. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now. Oh! Cardiac.